Now, I've been told to put the microphone as close to my mouth as possible, so having watched Taylor Swift on many occasions, this I think I have mastered. Well, a very warm welcome to you and a great turnout to this, the second of our conferences on oil, gas and renewables, investing and arbitrating in Latin America, which we are co-hosting, I'm pleased to say, with Queen Mary University of London and its School of International Arbitration. And in particular, I would like to say hello to the many students here in the audience, which is great to see you all filling up the seats. Others who we are extremely grateful first and foremost to our generous sponsors, Mundi, without whose support this event would not be possible. And so there is a special welcome to Clémence Prévot, happily here today. Others whose association with the conference has been key to its success include the Brazilian National Petroleum Agency, delighted to see their Attorney General here in the audience, Banco do Brasil, the Brazilian Embassy here in London, and the ICC International Court of Arbitration, a glistening roll call, each of whom has representatives here. And last but not least, our media partner, Arbitration Channel. Clyde&Co's own connection with Latin America goes back to 1992, when we first opened an office in Sao Paulo. Now, we, Clyde&Co, also have offices in Caracas, which I'll come to in a minute, Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro, and Santiago. Arbitration is definitely part of our DNA. For those of my generation, we all started at Clyde&Co doing charter party disputes and arbitrations, and what fun they were. And now we cover every single type of arbitration that there is on a global basis, and I think it's fair to say that we are now one of the largest firms in the world who specialize in dispute resolution. Latin America never lacks for excitement. And I was thinking, particularly coming here, of the day that we opened our office in Caracas in 1999. When we took off, there was one ruler, and when we arrived, there was another. And that was Hugo Chavez. That's when he arrived. And blissfully unaware of what awaited us, we flew down to the airport, which itself is quite a tricky airport to get into, and noticed out of the windows a number of tanks on their side smashed against the perimeter fence. So from this we gathered things were not in the best of conditions. We arrived, we managed to get to our hotel. We were told that there was a curfew in place and we couldn't leave. Now, we had organized an opening party for over 400 people in a nearby country club. So there was the food and there was the drink, all organized for 400 people and a curfew. Well, what should we do? Well, obviously, go. So we did. And we turned up at this country club, just 5 brave souls from Clyde&Co, plus 2 marine engineers off a ship who were Scottish and were not going to give up free evenings, booze and food. And we ate and drank what was there for 400 people and made our way happily home. Amazingly, Aurelio, who is our partner who started the office in 1999, he's still there to this day, and he is one of the very greatest optimists I have ever come across in my life, which he needs to be. So anyway, finally, thanks to all of you for coming here today, making this possible. Your presence here makes everyone's efforts worthwhile. And now I hand over to Mundi. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you also to Clyde&Co for the invitation to present some of our data on energy arbitration. So to start off, I'll give you some idea of the methodology we use so you know how reliable the data is. So as of September 2023, we had over 80,000 case documents freely available on Mundi, as well as over 70,000 profiles on UseConnect, the professional network for the arbitration community. So that involves both individual profiles and firm profiles, which also help us gather data. But most importantly, we have over 40 partnerships around the world with major arbitral institutions and associations. You have a representation here. So we get a lot of data from these partnerships, as well as, of course, enforcement proceedings in national courts and national and local courts. So ICC is one of our main partners, ICSID, the International Bar Association as well, through which individual practitioners can also submit case documents. And of course, all of this is done respecting the boundaries of confidentiality. There's nothing, we don't breach confidentiality, and that's an important point because it's always a question we receive. Everything remain confidential. It's usually an opt-in, opt-out from the parties to decide whether they want their awards published. And even then, we have agreement with our partners to pseudonymize or anonymize the decisions, so that, again, we respect confidentiality to the utmost. And so in LatAm specifically, you can see we have partners with CAN Mexico, CAC CCB in Bogota and Mercosur. We have a number also in Brazil, which I won't go specifically into. But that being said, unfortunately, the data we have for the Latin American region is quite limited because, as you are aware, a lot of the data a lot of the arbitration is actually externalized. It's not happening in Latin America for the most part, even though now international firms also have offices in the region. And so I'll start by showing you the number of cases we have available on Mundi. So the caveat is, again, the data I'm showing you is, of course, only available on Mundi and NewsConnect. So it's not a global representation of the trend in energy. But we are the most comprehensive database in international arbitration, so we do believe it does represent, the general trend in energy arbitration. So as you can see, the number of cases in energy arbitration have grown exponentially, actually. There's a dip in 2015, which we assume is actually because of the Paris Agreement negotiation and subsequent conclusion. So especially in investment arbitration, this led to an increase in the number of cases filed these years. Then you have a dip in 2020, of course, the pandemic, and it's slowly growing back up. But if we look at the data from some of the main arbitral institutions, we see that there's kind of a plateau still, and some of them even report a decrease in their caseload. So we'll see how that evolves in the next few years. But clearly, we're just going back up from the pandemic.
If you just move away from the speaker,
sure. Go on the other side. Thank you. And so when we talk about energy arbitration, I'll go very basic here, but I'm sure you're aware. So we talk both about oil and gas and electric power. These are the ways, these are the subsectors we cover on Mundi. So we go from everything, all types of renewables, exploration, upstream, downstream, midstream. So we have it all. Of course, as you can see, most of the cases are still in oil and gas. It makes sense historically. This is an all-time data, so it's not just in the last few years. Arbitration is the favored method of dispute resolution in international energy disputes. So it makes sense that there's such a large number of cases. I won't go into the types of dispute because I'm sure this will be mentioned later on, but so you can see that oil and gas makes up for 62% of the cases on Mundi, so in energy arbitration. In the renewables, the solar sector is the one that's growing, and as you can see, it's one of the highest one. This can be explained, of course, and I'm sure this will also be mentioned by the panel, but so if you look at the World Energy Investment Report, you see that investment is actually growing, especially in the solar subsector, and investment in fossil fuel, has been decreasing in the last 5-6 years, while it's growing in renewables. So we do expect to see a growth in the renewable disputes because where investment increase, disputes tend to increase as well. So then just to give you, I won't go too much in details here, but so you can see this information also in the report and it's all contextualized and analyzed. So I'm not going to get into details here, but of course, commercial arbitration is prevalent. Ad hoc arbitration is, quite popular in energy disputes, which is interesting to see. But then in terms of arbitral institutions that are most administering most of the energy arbitration cases, you can see that, of course, it's always the same institution, I want to say. So ICSID, of course, in terms of investor state, is the preferred institution. But you can see then ICC and PCA are high up. The first three, so excluding ad hoc, represent 53% of all energy arbitration, institutional arbitration. So there's as we can see from every sector, really, it's not just energy, there's a lack of diversity in the institutions that are used, and you can see that in the top ones, we don't have any in LatAm or even in Brazil. So there's still some work to be done here, but it's interesting to see that now you have an institution in APAC that are actually growing in number of cases in energy as well, but not yet in LatAm. However, in the last 2 years in LatAm, we do have 2 arbitration centers that have a growing number of cases. And these ones, so I have a list here of the ones with the biggest number of cases in energy arbitration available on Mundi. So it includes also Brazil, but you can see, you know, the representation in LatAm. And surprisingly, the ones growing in the last 2 years are not even in this list. These are the Arbitration Center of Mexico and the Arbitration and Mediation Center of the Ecuadorian American Chamber of Commerce. So we'll see where that goes, but there's it goes to show that there's a number of institutions in LatAm which are under used in international arbitration, but there are choices. In terms of seat, same here. We don't have a lot of diversity. It's the usual suspects, London, Paris, Stockholm, New York, Geneva. So the caveat here is that Washington, D.C. is, so we have to tag ICSID cases as seated in Washington, D.C. just so that they don't appear as unavailable information. But so it's not actually the most selected arbitral seat. London and Paris are the most used in energy arbitration. So it's still very much Europe and US based, even though as for the institution, you can see that we have seats in APAC that are also growing, especially Singapore, which has been reforming its laws in the last few years. And then I don't want to take up too much time from the panel, so I'll go quick here. So the representation also of arbitrators in energy disputes. In energy arbitration, so you can see same, it's mostly Europe and North America. The exception is Brazil. Brazil is very high up because they have a very developed domestic arbitration market. So of course, there's a lot of arbitration, a lot of Brazilian arbitrators selected in arbitrations. But in terms of international arbitration, it's still quite low compared to Europe and US, Canada nationalities. In terms of arbitrators, actually, I won't give you the top, but I do recommend you go see in the report who are the most active arbitrators in energy arbitration. But we do have in our top 5 2 Latin American arbitrators, the late Francisco Orrega Vicuña, and the other one I'll let you go check out. He's from Argentina, if you can guess. And then finally, the 3 most active law firms in Latin America in terms of local headquartered law firms. These are the law firms that have the most cases on Mundi so far. So the first one is from Ecuador, Zuleta is from Colombia, and the last one is from Mexico. So there's a diversity of local firms. It's not just in one country. You can see that local firms are active also in the sector, usually as co-counsel for big Anglo-Saxon firms, but still they are quite active, so it was interesting to point out. And that's it for me. So if you want to take a picture of the QR code, you'll be able to access the energy arbitration report. We do this report in different industries, so it's a unique report. No one else is doing this, just to showcase, you know, the data we have, and it's interesting to see the trends. But it's not just data, we of course analyze it, and we also have over 20 articles from leading experts, arbitrators, in-house counsels, lawyers, experts, academics, you name it. So we have really a number of contributions from all around the world. So there's also a number in Latin America. So I do recommend you take a look, and so to get some updates as to what's going on in the region in energy arbitration. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to our first panel. Thank you, Clémence, for the report. That was very interesting. Some findings there we were discussing here in the audience. I'll take a look at the report later for sure. So, because we know we have people reporting on this event, I know we might have a report on Cluer, maybe on Latin Lawyer. I think it's important to start with a disclaimer and clarify that the perspectives shared by our panelists here are their personal viewpoints and may include opinions presented for the sake of constructive debate and academic purpose. So these views do not necessarily endorse or advocate their official positions or the positions of the companies they're affiliated with or represent. Sorry to start with this boring disclaimer, but I had to. And moving on to the introduction, we had some excuses tonight. Eliza, Massi, and Gustavo Baquero couldn't join us for last-minute emergencies that they had. So I'm going to start introducing Maddalena Sala. Maddalena is a senior legal manager at European Energy with more than 12 years of experience in the energy sector. She has a master's degree in law from the University of Milan and a master's degree in financial law from University of Paris, Dauphine. European Energy is a Danish company which develops, builds, and operates renewable energy projects worldwide. During the 2022, European Energy had 1.2 gigawatts under construction. Is that it? And this year, the company has more than 1 gigawatt producing assets, half of which is PV, which is photovoltaic, and half of it is wind. Then we have Rodrigo Bahia on my left here, an international business lawyer specialized in management of complex projects, contracts in general, and corporate affairs, with 19 years of experience in the energy industry, especially oil and gas upstream. He's currently the Senior Contracts Counsel for the Offshore Atlantic Basin at SLB, formerly known as Schlumberger, based in London. Did I say Schlumberger well?
No, not so. But that's why we changed the name.
Very good. And to my right, immediate right, my colleague at Queen Mary, Carlos Bellorin, Associate Director at S&P Global, Commodity Insights within PEPS, which stands for Petroleum, Economics and Policy Solutions, based in London. Carlos specializes in upstream, regulatory and fiscal regimes, political risk, geopolitics, society engagement, business development, and the legal framework of the energy transition. He also, as I said, is a teaching fellow at the LatAm in Energy and Natural Resources at Queen Mary, University of London. And finally, on my far right, even though he's not necessarily a far right contest, we have Igor Oliveira. Igor is the head of legal for MOOVE Europe, a lubricants and fuels distributor with global operations. MOOVE is a Cosan Group company and an investee of CVC Capital Partners. Igor holds an LLM degree from the London School of Economics and Political Science and has more than 12 years of working experience in the energy sector, both in private practice and in-house in Brazil and the UK. And also, Igor is also the founder of the Brazilian Network, which holds some of the best drinks in town. So I recommend getting in touch with him. Okay, so I think we'll start this panel. As you could see, I'm the person with least authority on the table to talk about energy. So I'm going to try to mimic someone who is not so well informed on this market. And I'm going to start asking some questions. I hope they're interesting to you. And I'm going to start with regulation. Let's discuss the current regulatory environment for energy investments in Latin America. I'm going to start with you, Carlos, if you're okay with that. So grab your microphone there. And what are the key challenges and opportunities across different countries? So let's start general, wide, and we can jump into specifics throughout the panel. So what are the trends you've been observing in LatAm regarding investment capture and regulation?
Yeah, thank you, Carlos. I think Latin America is a trendsetter all around the world. I think the sense of urgency, that narrowing window for the energy transition has sunk in Latin America, and many other countries in Latin America have been taking measures in terms of regulations and laws. And they have been acting in consequence. They have been, I'm talking about E&P, lowering the entry requirements for companies to invest in Latin America. For instance, they have reduced issues like corporate guarantees, insurance. They have improved the fiscal terms, and they have employed the usage of permanent rounds in Latin America in order to award those assets before they become stranded assets. We have seen more collaborations between regulators and companies, and between regulators in different countries in Latin America. That's a trend. That is something that it was very strange, very unusual back in the day. But nowadays, regulators and companies are potential investors are talking more. Environmental concerns and social pressure has been growing. Latin America is one of the countries with more environmental related protests, and is something that is a trend as well. They have particularly two countries, Colombia and Brazil, that have been the forefront on implementing on-site renewable energy installations for the E&P projects. And they have been also at the forefront in the world in reducing flaring and venting operational emissions, and implementing regulations on that. These are the trends we're not seeing in Latin America.
Very good. Rodrigo, first, do you see these trends as well in your practice? And in your view, what are the key concerns for investing in energy in LatAm? And of course, if you're going to talk about the concerns, also the key opportunities.
Yes. No, thank you, Carlos, for the question. Thank you for being here. Thank you, everyone. Very good discussion. I agree with Carlos. I think the political risk that was mentioned in the introductory talk, that we know it happens in LatAm, always need to be tested against the resilience of the institutions, right? That's key. So we see many concerns about the different party in power, what's going to happen. And at the same time, we see institutions like ANP, like Carlos mentioned, that have advanced a lot in terms of making sure we can get investment for oil and gas. And talking on the perspective of oil and gas, I would say that some of the key concerns are historical for Latin America. We have this, tax burden, complicated tax environment, complicated labor litigation environment. If I can comment from Brazil perspective, especially. But again, we see that the problems are known and they are being acted. So we had a labor reform in Brazil. It's being tested. Some of the, let's say, provisions of the law were challenged in court. And then it's an evolution in progress to solve these historical problems. Again, talking about Brazil, I think when we talk about Latin America, Brazil and Mexico stand out in terms of GDP. And Brazil especially. We have an ambitious tax reform now in the houses, so it's also important to consider. And when we talk about the regulations to disincentivize oil and gas and incentivize renewables, there's a good discussion here, because we know that for those countries like Brazil and Mexico, we usually talk about the trilemma or trilemma of energy, right? It needs to be affordable, you need to have security to provide, and it needs to be sustainable. But for those countries, it's kind of a quadrilemma. It's like if you change your position from oil and gas, what will be your new position in the world? So it's not so easy to change completely. And it's very important to make sure that the oil and gas operations will be done in a way that is recognized by the stakeholders as sustainable. So then again, I see challenges and opportunities, because the challenges are the regulations to disincentivize, and there may have more taxes on oil, and we know more challenges about the ability of the companies to respond to spills. We saw some heated discussions in Guyana, in Brazil about this. But there is also the opportunity of innovation, right? The companies are hungry for new technologies to decarbonize operations, to make the operations cleaner. So I also see lots of opportunities there.
Very good. And since you mentioned Brazil, I'm gonna ask Igor to maybe go a little bit more specific about Brazil in this scenario, and about the potential challenges to investors there, and what areas Brazil could improve compared to other jurisdictions.
Thank you, Carlos, for the question. I agree with Rodrigo. We are very familiarized with the challenges that Brazil face, but I think we are tackling this to a greater extent. Brazil is full of opportunities, untapped opportunities, a great business, a great country for doing business, really. But when it comes to challenges, it's impossible not to discuss the cost of Brazil and the hidden costs, right? What we need to tackle for the foreign investors to see our jurisdiction as appealing and interesting. To begin with, I think the red tape needs to be addressed. There is this consensus that it's really hard to understand the time frame in which the authority will come back with a licensing application or a planning permission and so on. So it's important to address that perception that Brazil is full of red tape. I think Brazil is doing a good job in terms of digitizing the public administration. So we love technology in Brazil. So the public administration is overhauling all the systems, all the platforms, and that's really good for investors. We are not really after stamping papers and waiting for the administration to come back to us in, I don't know, God knows time period. So that's the first thing. Also, obviously, in 2016, we experienced a political turmoil, but our institutions are still there. They resisted to that. And so I think we can say confidently that Brazil is a democratic country, and investors should expect foreseeability and contracts being honored in that sphere. Also, because of the economic, the political turmoil that we experienced in 2016, we lost our investor rating, and I very much look forward to reverting that scenario, because that will make our jurisdiction more appealing to investors, and obviously put us on the radar of investors and green funds and so on. Further to that, I cannot forget the tax system. We have one of the most complex tax systems in the world. We have the tax reform underway. It's just being approved by the Senate and now going back to the House of Representatives. I very much hope it will be approved, because that will be one of the key incentives for restoring our investor rating, and that's critical, really. And obviously, I think we cannot forget the lack of policy coordination. We are talking about a federation here. So investors, they really don't understand when they have states contradicting themselves, or the federal government shying away from fixing these disputes in general, really. So, and time is of the essence, really, when it comes to renewables, oil and gas investments. We're talking about projects with high capex and so on. So that needs to be sorted. And we need a public administration that is agile, that is addressing the investors' concerns as and when necessary, really. So all in all, I think we have a good environment for doing business. We still have these challenges that we need to address, but we are doing our part, I think, for addressing those, really.
Carlos, any comments on what your colleagues just said here, or?
Yeah, I mean, as he said about Brazil, everybody knows the issues in Brazil, but I think Brazil compensates for that compared to other countries in the region. Brazil has been very welcoming to oil and gas investment generally, and they have, and something that I talk to my students, many of them here, that Brazil has an all-out strategy in order to offer all type of assets to any type of companies. For instance, you have the pre-salt. 90% of Brazilian oil is produced in the pre-salt, but you have a very good strategy put forward for mature fields. And they have created this amazing environment of Brazil focus, Brazil independence, focusing on those fields. And that's amazing. They could add about 250 and 300,000 barrels per day in a few years' time. That compared to other countries in the region and worldwide is just amazing. And you put that together, the good strategy, with the natural endowment of Brazil, because God is Brazilian, as everybody knows. It used to be Venezuelan in the 80s and the 70s, but now it's Brazilian. You have very low carbon intensity of Brazilian crude. It's 9 to 10 kilograms of CO2 per barrel of oil equivalent, compared to other countries, which is triple. In the US, you have oil and crude oils, which goes beyond 154 kilograms of CO2 per barrel of oil equivalent. And you have wells in the pre-salt producing 60,000 barrels per day, a well. Just to put that in context, that is Saudi Arabian numbers. In Venezuela, the most productive well ever produced about 80,000 barrels per day. That's Brazil. But yeah, that's Brazil. As I said, God is Brazilian.
That's impressive. Maddalena, any comments on the regulation, or shall we jump into contracts straight away? Yeah, let's go for it. So we're going to move into the contractual framework around this and how particular this is to in the energy sector. So let's take a look at the differences across different jurisdictions. Maddalena, if you can grab your microphone. Which differences do you see in contract negotiations, let's say, across different countries in Latin America?
So in Latin America, our company has invested in Brazil mainly, and we are in the renewable sector. So we have 183 megawatt in operation in Brazil in solar and wind, and we have been present since 2016. And we have so negotiated all type of contract in relation to the development, construction, and operation of the power plant. So we go from co-development agreement with the local developer, corporate governance, setup of the companies with the local partner, project financing, all the construction contracts and the operational contracts. I have to say that in Brazil, we see an alignment with the other, for instance, I work in other European countries in terms of contractual documentation and the good expertise also of the local law firm. The main difference that I have seen, especially in respect to the Nordics, because the company I work for, European Energy, is a Danish company, so Scandinavian mentality, is mainly during the contract negotiation, where, in Denmark we can have negotiation where we don't even see each other. We are on Teams, and you can sign a contract without having seen the face of your counterparty. While in Brazil has been very important, the face-to-face meeting, the fact of meeting the counterparty and building a relationship of trust, also on personal knowledge, personal relationship with the counterparty. And so this has been a real difference, the fact of you have to meet the people in order to finalize the contract. And I've seen this in particular with the arrival of the COVID, where we couldn't travel for 2 years. And the contract that we have closed during the COVID took so much more time than what we negotiated before, because we couldn't meet, even if we see the face. But the fact of not meeting was a problem actually for the contract negotiation, in my opinion. Yeah.
Very good. And I imagine in the contract negotiation. Sorry. Yeah, go for it. Jump in. I forgot to say that as a moderator, I welcome interruptions, arguments, fights, whatever. Come in. Just jump in.
That's good when dealing with Latin Americans in general. Well, I just wanted to chip in really and compliment what Maddalena says. I think it's critical for investors to understand that doing business in Brazil requires this personal touch. And it's almost impossible to do business there on a fly-in, fly-out basis. You need local knowledge. You need to have advisors with boots on the ground that understands the jurisdiction, and that's really valuable. That makes the difference in the long run, and how the projects are structured. So from experience, that is exactly what works. And yeah, well done on doing that. It's challenging.
Is this the norm across the whole Latin America? Because Latin America is such a diverse place, right? Like each country is completely different from one another. But this sounds like a commonplace thing, like something that I hear from all of them. Or is there a country that stands out and that to be different?
I speak for Brazil, but I tend to agree it's a common denominator, really. So that makes the difference.
Okay. Well, and within those negotiations, I imagine like one of the key aspects of negotiating is and in preparing for this panel, I discussed a lot with people from the industry, and there was a lot of complaining about allocation of risks, allocation of liabilities. And maybe, Rodrigo, if you can address a little bit of that, how you see the evolution of contractual allocation of liabilities in very complex projects, and, for example, integrated drilling offshore.
Yes. In upstream drilling, I can certainly comment about this. We were talking about predictability, right, a moment ago, and contractual risks are some of the things we always want to have very well measured, right? It's an industry concern to have a proper share of risk allocated between insurance companies, operators, contractors, how this is going to work, how each one will take a share that is reasonable for what they are providing. And before talking about Latin America, I think we need to understand evolution in general after especially the Deepwater Horizon Macondo event in 2010. That accident happened while the offshore industry was developing more and more. So two things happened at the same time. One was a big catastrophic event that put to test all of the contracts we had, or at least the contracts that participated in the incident, and the principles contained there. At the same time that the sector was looking for more and more options of fully integrated drilling, having contractors with full responsibility for the operations, and contractors becoming more efficiency in doing that. I mean, you don't need an operator contracting each party separately. You can have someone merging it all together. And now the risk aspect became super ultra important. So it's not a matter of taking a standard principle or standard document and applying. The negotiations became super complex. This in general. So no standard. If there is any risk, any catastrophic event, any environmental damage, everything will be discussed. What's the extent of negligence that a party will assume? What's the liability cap? What are the exclusions for the liability cap? All of that now become part of negotiations, very difficult negotiations. Now, at the same time, in Latin America, something very interesting happened. Pemex and Petrobras, and I will always use those as key examples of national oil companies in very important countries operating oil. They updated their standard templates. And their standard templates before were not addressing those risks. They did not have like the knock-for-knock principle or a very clear structure where the operator would be liable for environmental damages. That was not clear at all. We had contracts that were out of the principles of the industry, and now they are in the principles of the industry. So those are the two shifts I think that are interesting. At the same time, every negotiation became more complex. At least we are all playing an even game now. Now, even when you are discussing with Petrobras and Pemex, you are working under similar principles of the international industry. And this became an evolution as well. It's even if it's still difficult and there are pitfalls and there are concerns about negotiating, at least we can make sure we are all more or less in the international standards, including in Latin America.
It's interesting. And I know we have at least one former lawyer from Petrobras here that might want to comment about this during the question time. He might disagree with you. And since we addressed this, and from the perspective of negotiating and delocation, what about the difference in execution and with execution, the claims that come with it? Is this something you can comment about, Maddalena? Because of course you took an approach, and we realize the outcome here is basically that Latin America is quite uniform in the approach, which is different from other countries that you work with. But what about execution and claims? Is that difference around the region? Do you see any difference there?
Yeah, I think it's very much linked to also the contract negotiation and the fact of building this relationship of trust. What we have seen, in fact, is that the fact of meeting face-to-face and working on having a balanced contract avoids then claims during contract execution. And for the contracts that we have been negotiating during the COVID, where we have maybe not worked so much on build this trust relationship, then we have had quite a lot of claims from the contractors. And also difference with maybe with the Nordics is that you start more with a trust relationship unless it's proven otherwise. While in Brazil, my personal opinion is that I had the feeling you need to build up the relationship with the counterparty in order to avoid this. So it helps during the contract negotiation to build up this relationship that can help you during the contract execution. And the more you have built it, the more you will have also a balanced contract. It's important to have a balanced contract, in my opinion, and not a contract more in favor of the owner or because then you will receive more claims finally, because if the contractor is not happy, didn't have what he considered to be a balanced contract, then you will end up having claim during the contract execution.
Any comments on this, Igor?
I agree as well. I just wanted to explore the flip side of the standard documentation and agreements as well. MOOVE, when I act for MOOVE, really, we also have our offshore clients, and obviously they present to me standard contracts. And I think there's no leeway or room for negotiating these contracts, and it's really difficult to shift the risk and shift the risk accordingly to the party that should bear that kind of risk. So it tends to be a David Goliath kind of situation, and that needs to change. We need to see value in the standardization, but the procurement teams of these oil companies, they need to realize that a service provider is not prepared to face the same kind of risk or absorb this kind of risk. So it's really unfair, and that kind of conversation is not happening. So I think we need to encourage that. Standard contracts, yes, it's good for everyone, but with this caveat, we need to understand when it's applicable, when the profile of the service provider really. I'm not a drilling company, so I should not be bearing the same kind of risks with full indemnities, no caps, liquidated damage, and so on. It's just too cumbersome. We are not prepared to accept those risks, and there's no appetite for negotiating them, really.
But I agree with you, but I think it's also a difference of sector, because I moved from thermal power sector to renewable energy sector 7 years ago, and I agree that in the thermal power sector where I was working also waste to energy plant, also nuclear, and in that sector there was not this balance in the contract. There was no room for negotiation. So this is the standard of the client. We don't open to negotiation. However, I see this. We have there is more room in for this negotiation in the renewable energy sector, and I've always been on the client side in the renewable energy sector, and we are more open to negotiation. Maybe also because it's a newer sector where clients have less standardized contracts, so we are more open to see what also the contractor are. So in our sector, there is more space for this, but I agree in your sector is not maybe the case.
That's the beauty of renewables, right? It's new for everyone is learning. So
yes.
Can I make a quick comment, Carlos? Just a quick comment on what you said. Absolutely, I fully agree. I mean, it's the amount of investment a company needs to do as a contractor, and you receive a form and sign it. It's very difficult, right? I mean, we should be able to negotiate all the conditions, all the allocation of risks. Now, the issue is that national oil companies, this was almost never the case. You have some leeway of asking clarification questions, and sometimes they do an RFI before issuing the tender, but the reality is that we depend on their standard forms. Now, before those shifts, I would say in Pemex and Petrobras standard forms in recent years, they were standard, and there was a huge gap between the allocation of risks between them and the international practice. Now the gap is smaller. It doesn't mean every issue is solved, not at all, but that's what happened.
So it is a positive outcome, you think?
It is positive.
Yeah.
There was an effort to tighten the gap between international standards and those national oil companies' practices. At the same time that post Macondo, there is no standard. So at the same time, post the 2010 accident, even the international standards are subject to debate and more negotiation. So every negotiation is really complex.
And every contract, we get to know about it mostly when, in terms of enforceability afterwards. Is that reflecting enforceability as well, or are there still challenges in the region for that?
No, that's another very interesting question and very important theme for Latin America, because when companies like Pemex and Petrobras implement concepts of international industry standards, like allocating risk to the operator regardless of the negligence of the contractor, for example, this is positive. This is aligned with the standards of the industry. But the judicial system in Brazil is not used to that. So sorry, going back to my argument. When companies like Pemex and Petrobras put that in their contract, it's a very interesting move of changing the perception of how the law should be applied, because they are important companies, right? If Petrobras writes a document, this is a very well recognized.
It has weight, right?
Has weight, exactly. So we are still to see how the courts would judge situations like this. Petrobras is applying arbitration in many of its contracts, so it's interesting to follow as well arbitration decisions in this sense. Looking forward to the next panel to see some of those discussions. But yeah, in general, in Latin America, in civil law countries of Latin America, which are the majority, the principles of civil liability are not only focused on the restitution to the party that suffered the loss or damage. It's also considering the duty of the party at fault to be the one paying for the losses and damages. So it is not so trivial to allocate risks in a contract in a way that one party that has more power or has more stakes decide contractually that this party will indemnify the other. It's something really disputable.
Okay. Any comments from the panel on that, or everyone agrees? Okay. So let's talk then about renewables and environment. And now I expect, a knife fight here maybe. Let's talk about social license and sustainable energy. Is this trending or is it hype? And Carlos knows that I'm going to ask him about this, but we've seen some governments in the region backing away from oil and gas. Could you make some comments on this?
Yes. I think Latin America, it's divided on this issue. I mean, we can find a lot of social pressure in the Andean countries from indigenous communities. Talk about Colombia, Ecuador in particular, Bolivia and Peru. These are in another league when it comes to social pressure and pushing their agenda against fossil fuels. For instance, in Ecuador, we have a recent example, first in the world to ban through a referendum operations in an existing current field, not any field, one of the most productive fields in Ecuador, 52,000 barrels per day, which is quite big. That represent also 25% of Ecuador's 2P reserve. So it was a big hit. So in August 20 this year, Ecuador put together a referendum and people voted against developing this field. So and the Supreme Court gave Petroecuador, the operator of the field, 1 year to close it down. Now Ecuador is contesting that, saying, well, we have 225 wells that we need to shut down and decommission properly. So it's gonna take longer. But that's how social pressure, indigenous communities can push a government to bulk away $30.6 billion in the next 10 years. So that's a trend. Colombia as well, President Petro assumed power this year with a strong anti-hydrocarbons, anti-fossil fuels agenda. He put together a tax reform, a massive tax amendment, in which he was meant to tax the oil industry heavily in order to promote renewables. Unfortunately, he lost the two major amendments he did to the fiscal package. The first one that was being negotiated was it was planned in a draft of the fiscal reform that he will impose a windfall profit tax on oil and gas companies, oil and gas profits. and it was negotiated that that will be not including the fiscal reform, but instead a provision about the non-deductibility of royalties on income tax was put together and passed. Of course, after it was passed, fiscal experts saying, well, that's clearly unconstitutional. And on Friday, the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court in Colombia, overturned that provision, which is never heard of. I mean, it was the only country in which royalties weren't deductible from income tax. So unfortunately, President Petro lost these two major reforms, and that represented about $1 billion for the next 10 years. And he still has a very strong narrative against oil and gas. If you see President Petro talking at the UN, he will compare oil and gas and coal with cocaine industry, which is, I think, the comparison is nonsense. But he also implemented this, or kind of implemented this policy of no more new exploration contracts in Colombia, but is kind of backing away from it. But despite the fact that Colombia has this, or President Petro has this new policy against fossil fuels, I think pre-Petro, the country was doing very well in terms of decarbonizing oil and gas operations. Colombia has been, again, in the forefront of reducing flare and venting in the oil and gas regulations, implemented the first regulation on awarding areas based on how well the companies, the interested companies, manage CO2 in their operations. As a matter of fact, in the 2022 new areas award regulations, there is a provision saying that the only mandatory provision in order to award areas will be the CO2 management. That can be combined with the other more traditional bidding parameters, including additional royalties, profit sharing, signature bonus. That is one of the few countries in the world that has that provision. Unfortunately, that because of the policy of no new exploration areas in Colombia, that is not being tested. But I think that will become a trend in the region, how well the GHG emissions are managed. But yeah, that's I think it's not a hype. I think is real, and the two major players in South America, say Pemex, something else, Ecopetrol and Petrobras are quite serious about their sustainability of operations and kind of diversifying at least a little bit of their portfolio into renewables. Well, the best example is Petrobras going into wind. You have a pretty good, still a draft, still a bill, CCS bill about to be passed. But Ecopetrol has been implementing other methods in order to reduce their CO2 footprint in current operations, including connecting oil and gas fields into renewable projects in order to power their operations. As you know, 80% between 70 and 80% of the CO2 footprints in oil fields is how they are powered. So they put together the Castilla 3 solar park, which has a capacity of 21 megawatts, and there are plenty of projects in Colombia, in Argentina as well, and Petrobras about that. Yeah, it's not a hype. I think it's they are doing. They are not diversifying as away from oil and gas as European players, but they are reducing their footprints in oil and gas operations. That's what they're doing.
Okay. So that sounds to me that maybe oil and gas, they have a role to play in this energy transition. What do you think, Igor? And with that, what are the legal and regulatory changes you anticipate impacting the region? Yeah, but please first confirm if my assumption is correct about oil and gas.
Carlos, I do agree. I still think oil and gas has a role to play in the energy transition. My life is really easier now because Carlos made this fantastic introduction about the topic. Currently, I think society is sending mixed signals to the oil and gas industry. On the one hand, everyone wants renewables, transition to net zero. But on the other hand, we still have the demand for oil, energy. We're talking about energy poverty at the moment, right? So how can we compatibilize these two interests, right? And on that, I think oil and gas still has a role to play. First, because we need the revenues to fund the transition and the renewables projects. And all oil companies, they require that. And obviously, they have their investors. So they need to provide sustainable returns. They need to have revenues to fund the projects. And the demand is still there. And it's going to be there for a while. So for me, it's quite shocking to see jurisdictions walking away from new explorations. And obviously, there is also the political argument, I suppose. Are these jurisdictions, are these populations doomed to poverty, to energy poverty? Are they prepared to walk away from all these tax revenues? Are we failing the global south again? These are all questions that we need to address and we need to answer in context, you know? So that's my view, that's my perspective. I think there's still a role to play, really. Obviously, together with carbon capture projects and doing whatever we can to address ESG concerns and so on, really.
Okay. So, yeah, please.
Yeah, going on into the energy transition topic, I can say I also agree a bit that there is we also see an energy transition from the big oil and gas company, especially we have this is public news now. We have signed a memorandum of understanding with Petrobras to co-develop a Power to X project in Brazil. So we see also, and we have been talking with the Energy Transition Department. So we see also change into this big state-owned oil and gas company towards the renewable energy sector. Yeah.
On that, yeah, that's something that's a very well kept secret about Brazil. Brazil do have a massive environmental program and renewable program. They do, but they have the biggest single, most important, relevant strategy to increase production in oil and gas. So when you see Lula talking, I was like, okay, it's about the environment, it's about renewables. He never talk about that Brazil is going to be the 4th largest oil producer in the world, producing 5.5 million barrels per day in the next 5 years. That is out of charts. But yeah, and I remember when Lula was running, he was interviewed at the Times Magazine. And these journalists doing the interview say, okay, you know, President Petro in Colombia, now in power, he will be banning new exploration. Are you going to do the same? And I say, no, I'm not going to do the same. I'm going to offer every single area in Brazil because the world needs Brazilian crude oil. We have the most ambitious renewable agenda in the world together with other countries, but oil and gas in Brazil is going to flow.
So it's not necessarily transition. We need to find a new name for it. And I saw being mentioned a couple of times here, the CCS, right? The carbon capture and storage, which is something really interesting. But is this something that will come more to Latin America, or do we still have a lot to catch up on that? What do you think, Carlos? And maybe
we're lagging behind in CCS, despite of the fact that we have proper geological conditions. Well, many of the countries in Latin America to do it, but we're lagging behind. Brazil is the only country in the region right now that is about to pass a CCS law. and regulation. Mexico, during the Mexican reform 2014, included CCS as one of the major mechanisms in order to combat climate change. In their climate change law, they put together a CCS institute. They put together almost all the institutional capacity to do it, but with President AMLO coming into power in 2018, that everything stopped. We have seen some efforts in Colombia as well, but we're nowhere, or Colombia is nowhere near proper regulation CCS. Argentina as well, but yeah, I think we're lagging behind on CCS.
Okay. Well, and I just because I need to jump into the S in ESG, but we can talk more about this when we have questions from the audience. One thing that has been in the agenda for international investment arbitration for sure, and on energy projects, it's the importance of community engagement. So I wanted to ask Maddalena to talk a little bit about this because it's something that I know it's important to her, and she can share some good experience with us about this and how this is important for the projects.
Yeah, thank you. So in our project in Brazil, we have, during the construction and now the operation, we have ensured the engagement of the local communities by way of hiring local people for the works during construction and also the operation of the plant. But in addition to that, we have also implemented some social projects. And we have done several, and one of these projects, we have done it in Pernambuco. We have a wind power plant. I can show maybe the picture of our plant. It's a 90 megawatt plant in the municipality of Poçao. And in this municipality, there are women who are artisan, and they are making a kind of sewing, which is called Renaissance lace. It's this kind of job. So this is a product made by the women. And unfortunately, in the past decades, they've been exploited by middlemen, and they have that were buying the final product from them and for very low money and selling it for a high price to companies which were then selling it to the final customer. So we have implemented a project so for them to sell directly the products to the final customer. We have done, it took 1 year. We have done several months of courses. We have united more than 100 women from 40 different communities. And we have done financial courses, accountability courses, administration. We have opened a shop where they can sell the clothes directly to the final customer. The association, we have united them in one single association. We have opened an Instagram account where the association is managing the account and they can post it. And in order to make know the project to the at least to the local community, to the municipalities around, we have done a fashion show, which I can show the picture. So this is the launch of the collection. You can see one of the products that they're making, and there were hundreds of people to the fashion show. And yeah, so this is one of the projects that we have implemented in Brazil. Yeah.
Okay. And besides making your job more, give more purpose to what you do, is there an economic regulatory benefit, like something for the company as well that can incentivize other companies to do this kind of thing?
Yeah, so we believe that these kind of projects they are touching hundreds and hundreds of people, because as I said, we have united more than 100 women, and this will touch their family, and also is bringing also more tourism to the municipality, and it helps us because we believe it prevents from receiving claims. So it lowers down the risk of claims from the local area. I have to say also that when first we invested in Brazil in 2016, most of our projects that we have made them under the performance standards. So just for the public, the performance standards are guidelines implemented by IFC, International Finance Corporation. And since we have invested in Brazil together with Danish Investment Fund, which is a fund that invests for in the developing countries, they apply the performance standards. So there are other financial institutions that choose to apply the performance standards when doing investment in developing countries. So we have started in this way. So our social projects were first done in Brazil, and to comply with the performance standards. But then we have developed an internal policy where we are making this also on top of the performance standards. This project is not made within the performance standards, but on top of that. We have also done other projects, social projects that were within the application of the performance standards, such as for another power plant in Paraíba. We have, in order to help the local communities, outside the city, basically the communities didn't have running water. So we have drilled, and where we have created 2 wells, so where the people of the local communities can go and take potable water. We have built a church. So this has been made within the performance standards. And then we have done also other projects to respect these guidelines.
So this address community welfare, but also address economic aspects for the company, and especially avoiding claims. Yeah. When it comes to investment, and if the panel wants to chip in on this, how important ESG has been for investing? Like, is this something that is always there? It's something really relevant, or is something that goes on the annex of what you're discussing in terms of investment in the region?
It's for me the question.
Anywhere. We can generate a little bit of chaos now.
Well, okay. Talking from the perspective of a contractor of big operators. Well, first of all, yes, it's everywhere, right? I mean, it's in every, let's say, requirement for contracting. And the ESG is evolving as well, right? You have different topics, environment, human rights, and all of those topics evolve, and the industry is all investing on them together because we know it's important. Now, when you ask, for example, a company with less ESG commitment will certainly lose a tender for a company with more ESG commitment, then the discussion becomes a bit more tricky. I think we still need more clarity or materiality for those impacts to be really measured in the way the contracting occurs, at least from our perspective. But we certainly see a visible commitment everywhere in the industry, from operators to contractors. In oil and gas, I can say for sure it's visible. You need plans, in contracts, commitments, make sure you are providing, and the companies have their own plans, so it's a fact.
Shall we open for questions from the audience? I think yes.
Yeah,
sure.
Got a quick question.
Can someone take a microphone?
I'll go grab it.
Or go there.
Small room. Right. So very quickly, I think Carlos Bellorin talked about Brazil producing 5.5 million barrels a day, right? That's a very relevant number. My question is about carbon capture and carbon credits on investment. Okay, so carbon capture, we're in the UK, right? So the UK is investing 20 billion in the next 20 years in carbon capture projects, right? I mean, doing a cluster between a cement plant, a power plant, a refinery to capture that carbon, right? Latin America, Carlos, you talked a little bit about Colombia, a little bit Brazil. How is Latin America looking at carbon capture, which I think is the real energy transition, right? I mean, renewables are great, but they don't give you base load to run a city, right? Like a power plant. They don't give you the produce from the refineries. So you need to extend the life of refineries, which is carbon capture, right? So in terms of that investment and carbon credits, how do you see that moving forward in LatAm?
In terms of CCS, I think the region, as I said, is lagging behind. But I think Brazil is going to go big with it. Petrobras is already one of the top CCS player in the region, but there is no regulation. If you don't have a proper regulation, it cannot go big. The advantage is that this project that is already being passed in the lower house, and I expect to be approved the first quarter 2023, is a baby of the current Petrobras CEO when he was a senator. I think, yeah, they're expecting regulations in order to go big on it. And this is a cautionary tale. I mean, for Latin America and any country in the world, many companies are committed to solutions like CCS and even diversifying their portfolio. And but you have to have proper regulation and proper institutions to regulate those very technical aspects of the industry, and avoid becoming a man with a fork in a world of soup. Companies are asking for it. Countries and governments are aligned with companies in reducing the CO2 footprint, but we need proper institutions and regulations to make that happen.
And I agree, because carbon capture is actually a very expensive process. I mean, you're building, besides, next to a refinery, you're building a new plant. Harbour, for example, Stanlow refinery in the UK, it's from 1920s, right? Built by Shell, then kept in the Second World War. Now they're building a new carbon capture plant, which is almost half a billion pounds, right? And it will take 5 years, engineering, delays, all the rest. And they're creating, a bunch of other clusters which cost over 20 billion pounds. So you need the investment, you need the incentive from the government, and that's why I also wanted to use your opinion to ask the Brazilian panelists, which I think are the biggest producers of CO2 in the future in LatAm, on how they see from a financing perspective the two things, the carbon capture and the carbon credits, which is a big topic over here in Europe, at least for now. And I stole the microphone.
I'm glad we discussed CCS, and I think carbon credits are important piece in this equation, really, because in my view, CCS will only take off when companies have the incentive, not only from the government, but also from the market. So to my mind, it's really important to establish a regulated carbon credit environment in Brazil, so CCS projects can really be deployed on top of the legislation that Carlos mentioned, that I think it's almost there, really. So combination of a regulated credit market, give incentives to the players, together with public incentive. And I think the new green sustainability bonds issued by Brazil will help on that front too, as well. So all that in conjunction, really.
Any more questions? Do you have something to say?
My question is mainly to Igor. You mentioned risk, and that many times big oil companies do not offer a room for negotiation. The contract's put on a take it or leave it basis. Has that been a deal breaker for you because you're not prepared to take so much risk? And if not, do you adjust your price to incorporate that risk into your business plan? And if yes, how do you quantify the risk?
Feel free not to answer if you don't want to.
Felipe, thanks for the question. that's a very interesting, there is a very interesting debate within our organization, within our company. As a legal department, I'm always bringing awareness to the business, helping them to quantify the risks. And I'm always of the view that we need to reflect that in our price. But sometimes it's difficult. And I've seen we walking away from opportunities because of that, because the counterpart is not willing to negotiate or not willing to review the contracts. And we are not asking for big changes, you know, we're just asking for reasonable changes and amendments, and it's not moving. And as I said, we are not a drilling company, we are just a service. We're just supplying lubricant oils to offshore operations, and still no discussions, and it's take it or leave it, and that's really bad. And that kind of discussions needs to be entertained, really. Yep.
Any more questions? Can you keep there for me? We have time, I think, for 2 more questions, and then we need to.
I'm gonna try to be quick. My name is Renan. I'm from Brazil as well, and I'm a PhD student in the carbon credits field. So I would like continue the question just like really quick, just to ask you, what do you think, if you guys believe that in this transition that as we are talking about, we can say that the carbon credits are a kind of solution to help the oil and gas market to continue in the market and the future. And if so, what factors do companies should consider when purchasing carbon credits?
Try to answer that. I can take that one. Well, as I said, I think that the carbon credit market, regulated market, it's really critical for the transition. It will help companies to be incentivized to invest in CCUS, but it's not only something important for the oil and gas industry. It helps on the renewable side of things. To my mind, and that's my personal opinion only, it's really critical to understand what kind of carbon credits projects we're talking about. There is a lot of discussion about taxonomy and what kind of projects we are using to create these credits, and that's an entire panel in itself. But that's very, very important in terms of due diligence, understand better about the project, what kind of projects generating the credit. And that's good for everyone, not only for the oil industry, but also for the renewable sector, really. It's just an extra incentive for the transition, I would say.
I would just make a quick comment because when Schlumberger became SLB, we are committed to what we call the Great Balancing Act, and that means really decarbonizing the world, right? That's our ambition, and I would just say that this is very mature in other places, right? In Europe, in the US. So we know it's possible, and there are technologies. And SLB, for example, has very interesting technologies to support that. So it's happening. Why Latin America is lagging? Well, that was discussed already, right? Is regulations, is somebody has to pay the bill, and until we find this math, this is going to be more difficult, but it's happening. There are projects as well in Brazil, like Carlos said, and this is going to take off.
Okay. Felipe, are we allowed to take one more question? Or okay, so. Yep.
Hi, thanks. So my question is going back to the last point that we were discussing about ESG. So I think it probably is more for Rodrigo and Maddalena. I'm curious as to how the companies that are negotiating these investments in the countries think about the ESG and how they price it. So to your point about if you're competing with another company that's offering a bit more of an ESG solution, quote unquote, in a project, and whether, I mean, you could probably say, I'm going with the minimum standard and this is what the requirement is, or I could go with more, but you probably have to price that in. And whether you've seen an increase in these costs, ESG costs, in the past 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, from our side, so as I said before, when we had started investment in Brazil, we had to comply with the performance standards because otherwise we couldn't have financing. So we invested with a partner that asked us to comply with the performance standard in order to get funds. But then we think it's coming back to us in several ways. Also, we have seen, maybe as Rodrigo said, it's not because we do ESG that we win a tender. No, it's true. But on the other side, sometimes if we don't pay attention to these items, then it could damage the company. Because, for instance, in our company 1.5 years ago has been on, at least in Denmark, in the medias for a long period. We have received a lot of critics because we bought a solar panel where some parts, some component of the panels were produced in a region which in China has been declared also by UN as using forced labor to produce these components. So the fact of not paying attention to these matters has damaged our company. So that's why we are also choosing now to pay more attention to the ESG topic.
Sorry, I said that that was the last question, but I saw Queen Mary Alumna raising her hand, and I need to let her ask a question. So there, and we're going to try to answer really quickly so we can go to the break.
Thank you. Thank you for...
Yeah, just be close to it.
Thank you for the interesting discussion. So my question goes to Maddalena, I think. From the very beginning of the session, we noticed that when we talk about Latin America, investment in Latin America, we talk about different types of risks, yeah? So I just want to know what kinds of, when it comes to contract, what kinds of like contractual clauses or contractual tools you use in order to tailor your contract compatible with the situation of Latin American countries and to cope with different types of risks and uncertainties and, you know, regulatory changes and something like this. Yeah.
Maybe even the political risks of the region.
Political risks mostly.
Yeah, it depends, I will say, from which kind of contract we are speaking. In matters of contracts for the construction, we start to use normal international standard, but we are open to negotiation. We go into the negotiation with the contractor, so to have a balanced contract. And yeah, that's... maybe I didn't got the question well. So.
But my question was that exactly how do you make this balance in your contract? Because from the discussion,
yeah, so we share the risk that, for instance, maybe in some other sector, some clients are pushing the change of law risk or the soil risk into the contractor. So we take this risk. If we have not paid the contractor to do extensive soil researches and surveys, we don't push this risk into the contractor. We keep it. If we have paid the contractor to do such kind of surveys, then we push the risk into the contractor. It depends. We try to balance what we are paying, actually. And also the change of law, the political risk is a risk that we as a client, we take.
Well, with that, I would like to thank our panel and Igor, Carlos, Rodrigo, and Maddalena. I know Carlos was dealing with an urgent matter here just before the panel, but so thank you for sticking to us. And thank you for your questions, and Felipe for making this happen. And now let's go to the break. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. We are very happy to see many of you here. As you may have noticed in the program, this panel was meant to be moderated by Maria Fernanda. That's not my name. I'm Felipe Esperandio. Fernanda had to fly to Uruguay to attend a client meeting, so I'm replacing her. We are lucky to have a diverse panel today because each of the speakers, they specialize in a different aspect of what contributes or are a part of international arbitration in Latin America. We have Nilo at the far end. He represents the Brazilian National Agency of Petroleum, Natural Gas, and Biofuels. You may have heard about the agency in the previous panel. It is commonly referred to as ANP. ANP regulates the sector and grants the concession contracts to develop and explore the oil fields in Brazil. And in those contracts, arbitration is mandatory as the mechanism to resolve disputes with the investors. Nilo is a public attorney, and he coordinates all the arbitrations in which ANP is involved, and he will bring the perspective from the state. Next to him, André. André is the general counsel for dispute for CSN. CSN is a large conglomerate in the sectors of steelmaking, mining, cement production, and more relevant to this panel, they own 25 hydroelectric power plants, 5 solar farms with 3 more under construction, and 1 solar project. And he's going to bring the perspective of a private company. Nicholas, who is next to me, represents the ICC International Court of Arbitration. We all know what ICC means for dispute resolution. They have celebrated their century anniversary last month, and they are the most busy and the leading international institution in Latin America. Maria is a lecturer in Queen Mary, University of London, who specializes in investor-state dispute settlement. LatAm has been the region that has concentrated a disproportionately high number of ICSID and investor-states arbitration, and Maria will give her views as to why is that so. And Alan is the vice president of Compass Lexicon, which is a global economic consulting firm. And Alan has worked as an expert in quantifying losses and damage in many regions, and he will give his perspective of arbitrations in Latin America. I propose that we start discussing arbitration against state and against state-owned entities. And I will ask you, Nilo, to kindly explain to us in a nutshell what is the prevailing model for arbitrating against the state or a state-owned entity in Brazil.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. And a disclaimer, 1 year ago, me and Felipe were sharing a panel in São Paulo, and today we are in London, so that's what promotion must feel like that. So it's very good to be here.
Next one is going to be in Ibiza, hopefully.
Or Singapore. And so I will divide my answer in 3 parts, so you can get the broad picture about arbitration in Brazil against the public sector. First of all, with the investment arbitration is off the table in Brazil. It was discussed during the 90s in the context of a very big privatization movement, and the government decided that was not interested in adopting ISDS because of the constraints that it could bring to the state's regulatory power. And I think Maria is going to touch upon this subject because that's what many states in Latin America are facing right now when we have this broad contest of backslash against ITA. So to sum up, ITA is off the table. International commercial arbitration, we have it, but the government doesn't like that much. So, for instance, we have very important laws that of public contracting that they forbid the adoption of foreign seats in arbitration agreements. That would be the case, for instance, of the law of public-private partnership. It must be, according to this law, which is very relevant, Brazilian-seated arbitration. Nevertheless, in some very strategic purchases, let's say the acquisition of vaccines during the pandemics, or the purchase of weapons, where you can basically, you only have one supplier, and this supplier has like the bargain power, the government might well accept the adoption of international commercial arbitration. And we have several cases, not disputes, but we have several contracts with this kind of arbitration agreement. But lastly, by far, the prevailing model is domestic commercial arbitration, which arises out of concession contracts in various sectors that are subject to federal regulation. Oil and gas, which is my main expertise, but also telecommunication, transport, and as transport, I mean airports, highways, and also by river. So, and also in the electric sector, we have some very strategic contracts that possess arbitration agreements providing for domestic arbitrations. And I know that investors, mainly the ones, a foreign investor, he would prefer international commercial arbitration for sure. But the other side of the coin is that the Brazilian domestic arbitration model against the public sector is very well established and tested. To illustrate that, our first case was against ANP, a contract that suffered from environmental restrictions, and it was decided in 2006. So we're talking about something that happened 20 years ago. And since then, we had almost 20 arbitration dispute, 20 proceedings only against ANP. So it is familiar to us. It's not like in the ITA, the ESDS system, in which the state will try not to comply with the systems. It will try to somehow implement a backslash against that. That's not going to happen with our model. And it has the upside that it is very easy to enforce, because in Brazil, the domestic award has got the same effect of a judicial decision. So if we lose, we pay. On the other hand, if we gain, which is more common, to be honest, we will pursue the enforcement as well. So to sum up, we have the prevailing model would be the domestic arbitration.
Thank you. Nicolas, based on the ICC data, how often you see states involved in arbitrations in the sector of oil and gas? And when they are involved, what are the effects on the proceedings?
Thank you, Felipe. I would say the simple answer is very often. And I think part of that is the phenomenon that Nilo was describing as, well, you've seen it from the first panel. I think you'll see it again. Brazil makes for a very big market share when we're talking about arbitration, and not just international arbitration in Latin America. I would say around 35 to 40% of energy-related disputes in Latin America, from the perspective of ICC, involve states or state entities. As to how this changes, let's say, the nature of the proceedings, or what you can find in the proceedings when you have one of these players in there, well, I would say it's twofold. First, it changes the general overview you have on the case. once we see a state participating in arbitration, we immediately raise the alarms and say, okay, this case, we have to try it, or we have to administer it with the utmost care. Simply because, well, it's logical. You have the interest of a whole state, of a whole country at play in the arbitration. So that means that from an administrative perspective, we will keep a closer eye on that case. And then you have the other aspect, which is probably a more practical one. And it's how do the rules reflect the changes that can happen in a case where you have a state? And then you can divide it in three, probably, the three phases of the arbitration, let's say. Initial phase, development of the process, and then the concluding phase. First, initial phase, you will see the effect that the participation of the state has. For example, in the very, very early stages of the arbitration, when you're expecting the answer to the request for arbitration. We know at the Secretariat that states normally have a hard time retaining counsel because of all the, all the processes that are in place for a state to be able to retain the counsel. They have to probably go through stages of acceptance, maybe through Congress. There's politics involved. So in that respect, we know that we are going to receive a request to extend the time that they have to answer the request for arbitration. And when we receive those requests, the Secretariat normally has discretion as to how much time it grants, whether it grants it or not. And when we know we have a state involved, we take these considerations in our head and say, okay, we have a state and maybe they're having these very specific issues that we have to take into consideration when deciding whether to grant or not the extension. Then in the middle of the process, we know it's going to be more complicated just by the fact that there's a state. It's going to be a slower process. They have, for example, a harder time paying the advance on cost, again, because of budgetary restrictions probably. So we have to take this into consideration as well. And then for the final stages of the process, you might know that ICC, one of the elements of ICC's most important in the rules is the scrutiny of the award. Normally, the scrutiny of an award means that it will be approved or not by the court before it is notified to the parties. When there's a state participating, a special session of the court is made up for the scrutiny of that award. So you have a plenary session where all the members of the court, or most of the members of the court, attend and participate in the scrutiny of the award just because the award is much more important given the fact that a state is participating in the proceedings. So I would say those are the two big spheres of how the process can change with the participation of a state. General sentiment, and then the practical implications in the rules.
And it makes perfectly sense. You are dealing with the interest of a nation, which represents the interests of their citizens, and an award against a state could have an impact on budget that goes to social projects and so on. So that extra care and attention, in my view, it makes perfect sense. And perhaps what helps to explain the high level of states involved in oil and gas arbitrations is because it's a historical reason. In Latin America, it still prevails that nationalist instance in which the minerals, the oil belongs to the people, belongs to the state. And on that basis, the state is by necessity an active player and needs to be on the side of the concession, granting it for the investor to be able to explore it. So that is also one of the reasons why the states will be always involved in those disputes. André, and now from a private company perspective, you potentially arbitrate against state-owned companies from time to time because you are in the energy sector. Are there specific concerns when you do arbitrate against state-owned companies that you wouldn't have when you do arbitrate against a private company?
Felipe, first I will just say I'm very happy to be here and that the audience is full. So it is very delightful to be here. And I go back to a boring disclaimer that Carlos made in the first panel, that everything that I say here expressed just my personal opinion, not the company's. And going to your question, Felipe, I guess we've been talking on the first two questions here is about arbitrations that involve the state itself. And I think it's important that we establish a bit of a difference on the state-owned company, which is publicly listed, and the administration itself. And when the administration is a party on arbitration, we do face all the restrictions that Nilo said, that Nicholas also expressed. What are the concerns on how conducting the arbitration? And it's a bit different when you're dealing with a state-owned company that's, in my experience, on the cases that I experience, are publicly listed. It is very close to a private party. Obviously, I do have some concerns being a state-owned company, even publicly listed, on how, if we do need to address some transparency issues, and also if we do, and how this transparency will affect technical matters that might be in discussion in that arbitration. When I mean technical questions, I mean the object of the arbitration itself might be some engineering or something that is not relevant, that will be subject to that transparency. And in what extent this part of the arbitration remains privileged. I guess this is one main concern. And in addition to what Nicolas said, I've been, and also complementing what Nilo was saying, when the administration is a party, things tend to happen in Brazil as a site. And one of the most, or maybe the second most successful arbitration organization in Brazil is the Arbitration Chamber from the Canada Chamber of Commerce in Sao Paulo. And they also have some specific guidelines when the administration is a party, then they have it publicly available. Also, what the ongoing procedures are, you can see that on their website. So it is way different than what we experience on when arbitrating between private parties. But I guess my main concerns here would be transparency, always aiming on preserving the final result of the arbitration.
Thank you, André. And Maria, focusing on investor-state arbitration. And you'll be glad to know that we're not going to talk about Brazil now because that's inexistent in Brazil.
It would be great. Didn't need to use my time.
But our neighbors have been very busy when it comes to investment arbitration. In your views, what has been the contribution of LatAm for that mechanism?
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Felipe. You said they have 3 hours, right? No? Okay. Well, I'll try to do my best in less than 3 minutes, however. So to fully understand the contribution, the extent to which Latin American states have contributed to investor-state arbitration and relatedly the backlash, we need to face those two as the two sides of the same coin, let's say. And when I personally think of that coin, it comes to mind, I will be inevitably using the English translation of that. It comes to my mind in Greek. It's the saying, rainbow in the morning gives you a fair warning. And when we look at the history of Latin American states and ISDS, El Nove Tokyo, which was the historic vote of Latin American states against the ICSID Convention in 1964, was a pretty fair warning as to how things would evolve afterwards. Well, despite this no in that annual meeting of the World Bank, the ICSID was established in 1966. Was it very successful in the beginning? well know. It took 6 years before it registered its first case, and in the first 30 years, there were only 32 cases registered. The whole success, the rise and at the same time fall of the system started when Latin American states started getting all these cases against them. So nowadays, ICSID has administered in total 70% of the total known ISDS cases. By the way, I need to do that parenthesis. When I refer to ISDS, I basically refer to ad hoc investor-state arbitration, but I'm mindful of the fact that it's an incorrect use of the term ISDS, because even courts or other means of resolving investor-state disputes are ISDS. But I'm going with the flow, and I'm using the acronym for us to be on the same page. Now, so I was saying, before I opened that parenthesis, that ICSID has administered about 70% of the total known cases, and Latin American cases represent 30% of that. Needless to say that Argentina and Venezuela are the two states with the top, with more than 50 cases against them each. So enough with numbers, after all, I'm a lawyer. They are telling of the contribution of Latin America to the rise and fall of international investment law and ISDS, but the contribution of the region is not only quantitative, it is also qualitative in nature. And I'm not referring only to the large number of great practitioners, some of them in the room, who have contributed to the rise of investment law and ISDS. I also refer to cases. There are a couple of firsts and a couple of landmark cases that have shaped international investment law, and inevitably at the same time, they have been cited as evidence for the so-called backlash. Just by way of examples, very indicative enumeration. It was in a case against Mexico, TechMed, one of the first and most cited cases where one of the most important pronouncements of the concept of legitimate expectations was made. It was in another case, this time brought by an Argentinian investor against Spain, that sparked the controversy on whether MFN clauses can be used to import dispute settlement provisions from one treaty to the other. And it was in a case against Bolivia, Aguas del Tunari, the first case when an amicus curiae submission was made in an investment case, exactly as a means to alleviate all those concerns about the divide between private and public. And of course, I cannot omit to add to this enumeration Argentina's attempts to respond to the financial crisis, or Uruguay's attempts to reduce smoking by passing tobacco regulations that sparked discussions on the one hand on state defenses, and notably the necessity defense, and on the other hand, a concept that we already heard about, the state regulatory powers. And just to name a couple of names, Philip Morris and Uruguay, and then with regard to Argentina, CMS, LG&E, Sempra, and Enron. So these cases led to several inconsistent awards, and this has led to what I will call a challenge to you. Every time that you read an article that may be in scholarship, that may be on GAR, that may be Kluwer Arbitration Blog, whatever, if the word legitimacy or backlash, or that's the topic, make sure to check if at least one Latin American case is cited. And if you find any where this is not the case, can you please email me? I think I'll stop here because I've abused my time already.
Well done for summarizing 75 years in about 5 minutes. Alan, you have acted as a quantum expert in multiple jurisdictions, including LatAm. Is there a topic that comes to your mind, a recurrent or predominant topic that happens in LatAm and it does not happen or not as often in other regions?
Many challenges, I would say. Just to name a couple for the sake of time, inflation is one of them. For us economists, quantum experts, we need to value damages, and many times the way to do this is valuing the companies. To value a company, we need to many times see the history, the performance of businesses. And in many Latin American countries, we've seen history of very high inflation. And not only high inflation, like we've seen in Europe recently, but also over time, during many years. And this starts distorting the metrics, the performance of the businesses. So sometimes we see a business that has been growing for a long period of time, and then one needs to disentangle what's been growth, real growth of a company, and what's been just inflation growth. Because that growth can be then extrapolated and saying, well, these are going to be the future profits of the business. This is how it's going to be worth. So yes, having inflation there and distorting the metrics makes our life harder. There are ways to address it, but again, it's more work. And maybe another one, which is quite related, are the soft currencies. So soft currencies, or the local currencies, are soft in the sense that are volatile. You might expect, or there are unexpected depreciations or appreciations of the currency. And many of the businesses there generate their revenues, they have their cost in local currency. So there is a risk there of this currency changing suddenly without knowing in the amount, but generally materially. And there are ways to, this is a risk when measuring the value of a company, and there are ways to try to address this, but there are many, or there are fewer metrics, for example, trying to find interest rates or applying discounts for this risk of the soft currency that are not easily found, or that there are not interest rates that are commensurate or consistent with the currency of the business. So again, there are ways to address this. One can value a business many times in Latin America. The US dollar is a hard currency that is usually used to value the companies. But it adds another layer of complexity or the potential dispute. Then between experts will start discussing, well, the US dollar or the local currency compared to the US dollar, how is it going to depreciate or appreciate, and so on. So those are a couple. I mean, we've heard earlier in the previous panel differences in taxation, for example, the complexity of taxation in different jurisdictions. That's also additional complexities that, for example, valuing businesses in Europe, the tax systems are not all the same, but are more comparable across them.
On the point of inflation and quantifying the claim in US dollars, last month, Global Arbitration Review reported on a case in which a Brazilian contractor was awarded, had a favorable decision against PDVSA, which is the Venezuelan state-owned oil and gas company. And there were two claims. One was about $50 million, quantified in US dollars. The other one was about $500 million, and it was put forward as 3.5 billion bolivars. The tribunal awarded both claims to the Brazilian contractor, but they found that the one that had been put forward in bolivars, there was no request for monetary adjustment of that claim, and there were no index that they could link it to update it. So that $500 million today in the current exchange rate is less than $1.
I think that's really interesting. One of the mistakes that we see arbitral tribunals make the most in their awards is when they apply a local interest rate, but they use a currency from another country, which completely distorts the amount that is going to finally be granted to the party that is winning. And it's surprising to see that this does not go through the minds of the arbitrators when they're actually thinking about how much money effectively that party is going to receive in the end.
Just if I may, just one comment there, just to give a sense of magnitude. We were discussing Venezuela, and Venezuela, or even Argentina, has interest rates in local currency above 100%. If you apply that 100% to a dollar-denominated amount, you can imagine how quickly it can balloon.
And moving forward to the issues, the types of disputes that are usually subject to arbitration in LatAm, Nilo, the ANP, the arbitrations that involve your agency, can you identify certain issues that are always at play or trends in the claims when and how they're put forward?
Thanks, Felipe. And the answer would be yes and no. No, because half of the disputes, they vary a lot. They normally regard the fulfillment of contractual obligations, but that's the only common ground that they have. To give an example about a very recent dispute, we had ANP refused the assignment of the contract by a company to another because we thought that the new company was actually the old company. So it was a fraudulent assignment. And fortunately, we won that case. It was a 400 million reais dispute. So I think it was one of our most interesting disputes and pretty unique. And this is the one half of the broad universe of disputes that we have faced since the start of our experience. On the other hand, the other half can be divided in two groups of subject matters that somehow they repeat themselves. The first one is something that Carlos talked about in the last panel, involves environmental restrictions. To put that more clear way, when another public entity issues an act that has an impact to the concession contract. For instance, the entity responsible for issuing the environmental permit for a drill is refused. So in that would be 1/4 of the cases that have this kind of discussion, and the concessionaire tries to put the blame on ANP. So this I could consider a repetitive issue. Okay, so which is a contract that is terminated because of environmental restriction not imposed by ANP, but by another entity, public entity. And the second repetitive issue pertains to something that will not be subject to arbitration here in the UK. I discovered that today. We have something called field determination. So when the contract enters into the production phase, the boundaries, the geographic boundaries of the oil field must be set, because that's like the universe of where the operations are going to be implemented and where ANP is going to exercise its supervision. But depending on how the concessionaire proposes the definition of these boundaries, he's going to pay less or more government take, because government takes, just to explain, is like how much of the profit, put that very simply, how much of the profit must be paid to the state. So if the concessionaire splits the same contract in more than one field, the production level will decrease, and so will also the government take, how much he needs to pay to Brazilian state. And so we have 4 disputes, and one of them, to illustrate the sensitivity of this matter, involves $10 billion. One case, one of these 4 cases that I mentioned. And coming back to what I said, in the UK, and in the UK I mean the oil and gas regulator, now they've changed the name to NCA, North Sea Transition Authority. They don't think, and I think the judiciary agrees with that, you cannot discuss public law and arbitration. So first of all, it's impossible to, in my opinion, to distinguish private law and public law when you're dealing with a concession. But they have this opinion, and the regulator, he told me today that the judiciary has aligned with this position, this instance of an STA. So this dispute would not be arbitrable here in the UK.
Or taking back home some new ideas for arguments in your cases.
Maybe, yeah. I don't know. I cannot disclose that. But
and André, in the arbitrations related to renewable energy, in your experience, what are the common issues?
Well, Felipe, a bit different from oil and gas. The discussions, the subject of the arbitrations are more related to what is around the renewable. Infrastructure, services, technology, equipment. So in a very broad sense, we are talking about supply contracts. It's a bit, I said it's a bit different from oil and gas because oil and gas, we are talking about a commodity. So when you're talking about a commodity, you'll be seeing discussions about quality, delays, freight, performance or something like that. And on renewables, maybe there's some exception to that, but you'll see arbitrations related to construction, infrastructure, supply contracts, insurance matters related to the performance of those contracts. And also, and depending on the contract that you're talking about, you see from time to time some multi-party arbitrations also, because it will be common to see the parts of the contract being subcontracted. So, and this is a particular important matter to be dealt with when you're talking about, when you're negotiating the contract itself. And in my experience, it is important that my perspective here will be taken into consideration on the moment that the contract is born, which not always, it doesn't help, that doesn't always happen, but it does provide a different perspective, especially because being an in-house lawyer, you are familiar with what is the purpose and what do you want with that contract. So in addition to the science of the law itself, you can add what is the goal of at least of one of the parties. And it does provide a different perspective, and obviously also important in the execution of the contract and the final draft, especially on preventing some, I would say obvious, but when you're drafting it, it's not obvious. It's just obvious once you experience it. Some steps in the execution you can predict, and you can put some additional dispositions in the contract to prevent some of the disagreements that will arise in the future on the execution of the contract itself. So I wouldn't be that bold to say it will prevent a dispute, but you can prevent things that will easily turn into dispute and preserve the execution of the contract for a longer period.
And in the supply chain, the renewables industry, in which solar panels come from China, gas turbines come from Germany, arbitration is the perfect fit for this kind of contract.
Yes, yes. Well, when to use arbitration is a question that rarely is answered by one aspect alone. Parties is part of the equation. Situation of the goods itself in the market may be come into consideration as well. And so there are a lot of variables that you have to consider on choosing, even after choosing, okay, we'll be including an arbitration clause here, and then we turn up to where law and everything else. But that being considered, you said when you're interacting with foreign parties, it is more common to end up in the arbitration clause.
I will come back to that. Nicholas, and from the ICC perspective, what are the trends in the arbitrations in the sector of oil and gas that you see? And do you expect it to evolve, and how so?
So I came prepared with a very simple answer to this, and it was going to be more cases. But then Clémence stood up there and told us that it was in fact the opposite. But no, I think this has a logical explanation. So ICC right now has passed an amount of 20,000 registered cases in its history. This year alone, we've had around 700, and we expect to finish the year with around 800 new cases. And currently active, we have 1,700 cases. Out of those, 22% deal with energy-related disputes, and 24% deal with construction arbitration, which, as we know from the survey prepared by, the wonderful survey prepared by Queen Mary, published early this year, most of the energy disputes come from projects or disputes arising out of projects. So in general, we could say that ICC has around 35 to 40% of all its cases related to energy disputes, which is a lot. It is true that there's been a plateau, like Clémence was saying, in the last couple of years, mainly 2020 and 2021. But overall, if we go back a little bit to 2019, we see a 6% increase. And like Carlos is saying, I think we're going the other way around. It was a small dip, it's a plateau, and now we're going up. But the thing is that even if we consider that plateau, we see that construction and energy disputes kept going up. They were not as affected as other sectors. We will discuss probably later what some of these elements might have been and why that is the reason. But the fact is that we've seen in probably the most representative institution and amount of cases, an increase of 6% in the last 4 years, which I think it's relevant. So that's why my answer was going to be more cases. Yes, there's some caveats there, but I think we're going in that direction. Towards the more substantive aspect of what we can expect and to the future, it was discussed in the first panel. I think renewables is the easy answer there. I think that the transition that we're experiencing in Latin America, where, well, according to the IEA, around 50% of the oil and gas in the world come from Latin America, and around 50 to 60% of our energy is already renewable. We see that we're going to keep going in that transition, which is going to keep generating disputes. So I think renewables, although it's not going to take the place of project-related disputes specifically, or in a more general way, is going to create some more disputes in the future. And also decommissioning, that's a normal consequence of that transition. So I think that's where we're heading. I think we cannot expect many changes. I think projects is always going to be the main source of disputes in energy. But I think that as we transition into a greener environment, we are going to have disputes arising out of those elements as well.
So we all will keep having work.
I mean, everyone in this room is assured to have work for the next 10 years at least.
Good. Alan, we, in the last decade or so, we have been seeing a swing in political ideologies that come to power in LatAm. And the latest example came out of Argentina on Sunday. How does that impact those political changes? How does it impact on country risks? And as an economist, how those metrics of a country risk correlate with the risks of the private business in that country?
So, well, the example of last Sunday in Argentina is a pro-market party now. So it's actually decreasing the risk, or at least what the markets are showing. But still, changes in political parties, in political ideologies, can be accounted in valuation of companies, valuation of damages. The EC, I mean, it's widely accepted in the valuation industry that the country risk then is also reflected in the risk of companies operating in that country. There are tools that are widely accepted. So there isn't much discussion about that, even in Latin America. So it would be easy just to apply those approaches. For example, there's a very accepted approach that is called the yield spread approach. So it's looking at what the government bond yields are, the interest rate that the government bonds pay, and compare that to a risk-free country like the US. So that's the spread between the risk of the bonds of one country against the US is what is called the country risk premium. And then it's a one-on-one relationship with risk in the business. So if that spread is 4% for a country, then we're saying we add 4% to the discount rates for a business. Now, the thing is, many times in Latin America, you cannot just go and apply that widely accepted approach. And why not? Because these yields of the government bond yields, sometimes you have these swings in political parties, and either or there's a crisis and the country cannot pay those bonds, or the change in political parties comes and the new party says it's unwilling to pay those bonds, and the yields of those bonds then skyrocket, and it's not really reflecting the risk of business or doing business in that country. It's simply now a meaningless, or at least for a country risk premium perspective, it's a meaningless metric. It's just reflecting what's the probability that the country will default those bonds, how much you can recover from those bonds. So you cannot just apply that, and it happened many times, happened in 2001 in Argentina, 2009 and 2015 in Venezuela, again until last year probably in Argentina as well. And then one cannot simply go and apply the widely accepted approach in Latin America in general. It needs to evaluate what's the circumstances, whether it makes sense. There are other tools as well, but that's, again, maybe back to the first question, and another challenge in our work in Latin America.
For sure. Maria, and continuing on the topic, on the theme of political risks and swings in ideology, many Latin American countries ratified the Exit Convention to increase the levels of foreign direct investment. Some of these countries have denounced and withdrew from the Exit Convention. And there is at least one country that ratified, denounced, and re-ratified the convention in a very short period of time. How do you see those movements, and what does it mean for the market? Is it possible to quantify that in the costs of doing business in that region?
Thank you, Felipe. So let me unpack your question first and just give some background in case people are not familiar with that. So in accordance to Article 71 of the ICSID Convention, a good number of Latin American states denounced the ICSID Convention. This all started with Bolivia in 2007. Just to add some color, the then President Evo Morales stated in the context of the denouncement that ICSID was an absolutely unbalanced tribunal that always takes the side of transnational corporations. And in the same vein, in 2012, when Venezuela followed the lead and also denounced the convention, in the said statement, they noted that they are leaving ICSID. It was a necessary act to protect the right of the Venezuelan people to decide the strategic directions of the economic and social life of the nation. In between those two denouncements, it was Ecuador, the one that Felipe implied in his question. So Ecuador's case is amazing in the sense that they ratified the ICSID Convention in 1986. 2009, they denounced the ICSID Convention. June 2021, they signed the ICSID Convention for the second time. And
the next president is going to denounce again.
Yes, thank you, Felipe. Exactly. I was very successfully preempted because that's exactly the point. Right now, we are in a very good terms in a way. There is even a cooperation agreement with the PCA, between Ecuador and the PCA. But quite frankly, and before moving to the second and trickier part of your question, let me just say that this kind of pattern that the country's stance might vary depending on the government is not good news for the government, the country, the people, investors, and the list is long. So the second part of your question touches upon basically, is there an impact on the FDI attractiveness of the state? Is there a correlation or even causation between the existence of an investment treaty, including perhaps also an ISDS provision, and the increase of FDI inflows? And all this, for me to answer that in a simple and blunt way, I don't know. And perhaps to stretch a little bit more my answer, nobody really does. But this was the blunt, not sophisticated answer. The more sophisticated answer is that there are several empirical surveys trying to measure exactly this potential correlation. To summarize them, I will quote one of the latest ones from the OECD, 2018 one. So on the societal benefits and costs of international investment agreements. So basically the OECD concluded that it's very difficult to measure and come up with a concrete conclusion as to any potential such correlation. And in light of the difficulty that the methodology creates, and now I quote, "It is unsurprising that the several dozen econometric studies that have tested whether there is a correlation between the existence of international investment agreements and FDI inflows so diverse and at times contradicting results. Some studies found positive correlation, at least in certain configurations. Some found a very weak no or even negative correlation, and some other studies found correlation between investment agreements and greater inflows, but not necessarily from the states with which a treaty has been concluded." So what is the takeaway? There is a global consensus that we need investment for economic growth. Okay, but is there a correlation? We don't know. The best, I think, more concrete answer that we can come up with comes from another, and I will quote Nicolas now, wonderful Queen Mary survey, the 2021, which was conducted in partnership with the Corporate Council International Arbitration Group. And in that survey, respondents, so the people who took the survey, were asked to answer the question what kind of factors influence their investment decision. And they were offered with a couple of options. And you won't be surprised that each of them got more than 70%, and what was included? Commitment of the state to substantive investor protections, stability and predictability of the legal environment, as well as availability of ISDS. And I will leave you with that thought.
And it is actually unfeasible to draw this direct correlation because one would have to freeze all the other elements that can contribute to foreign direct investment, like currency devaluations, taxes, which is simply
it's a
not
complex
possible.
matrix.
So speeding up this round of questions, and André, I want you to explain better. You mentioned something like choosing arbitration is the first step, and then it comes many choices. What is the seat? What is the substantive law? Which is the institution? We know it's ICC, but just to make sure. How do you make those choices? Does your team have a list of pre-selected seats, pre-approved seats? Does it change depending on the nationality of the party that you're negotiating with? Can you give us an insight on how you make those decisions?
Yeah, sure. First thing that we have to realize is arbitration, when we come to a contract and we foresee an arbitration clause, it is not very different from others. We have three main factors: the place, the law, and who's going to run it, basically. In my experience, it is important to be as consistent as possible and to prevent all of the traps that you don't need when you are facing a dispute. So you should keep it as simple as possible, as consistent as possible. So you choose a site, okay, according to what parties are involved in the contract, and considering that common knowledge it's the second best option. First one is resolving the dispute at home, which is not going to happen. So the site, the law, preferably same of the site, and arbitrary institution. Nicolas is there to help us out with that. Normally it will be the ICC. Why consistency? So to avoid those traps that you don't need when you're facing a dispute. Getting to the part of your question, do we have a pre-selected list of sites and law? Yes, or here or New York. Arbitration is an exception for in my experience. It's not for everything. So having both sides as options is almost in all cases good enough, because normally you'll be dealing, as you used an example, with solar panels from China or equipment from Germany. So almost everybody will be satisfied with one of those sites. And once you choose one of those, you'll be consistent and choose to form the contract the same law of the site. When you come to the dispute, that normally it's a matter that when rather than if, you'll be comfortable in choosing what law firm you are going to handle the case, and they will be more comfortable in helping to choose the arbitrator or the co-arbitrator. So you avoid those traps that you don't need when you're facing an adversity of getting into a dispute. So being as simple, as consistent and inconsistent will help you out on that perspective. One additional thing that we also do consider, despite the ICC having provisions on preliminary injunctions and other providences, is how the site or how the local site does treat preliminary injunctions. This might come into discussion from depending on what is being negotiated in the contract. It is, as I said before, it is important that not only the contractual lawyers to take part in negotiating the deal from the beginning. It is as important as the litigators to take part in it, and not only on when it comes to the arbitration clause or the dispute clause, especially from the in-house perspective, because the in-house lawyer, he's basically a translator. He can translate the language of the engineer into the language of the law. This is something only I can do. I can go up to the operational site and see what is happening there. And I can talk to the guy. And he can tell me directly, looking me in the eyes, what's happening. What's the pain that he's experiencing. And this is something that I can understand and I can translate into the contract or into the next contract maybe. And definitely when the dispute arises, I can put that into words that the arbitrator will understand. So the outside counsel cannot do that. He doesn't have that access. He doesn't have the time. He cannot travel around all the world around to Brazil and see what's happening inside. Maybe he can, but it's not the rule. But I definitely can do that. And this does make a big difference when preparing the contract, when drafting the contract, and also when the dispute arises. One last thing that I wanted to add in the previous panel, I'm getting a bit off topic, but it's quite quick. We were discussing an inability to negotiate some clauses because this is given. If you want it, you take it. Otherwise, I do business somewhere else. It does happen also from time to time in the opposite direction. Just popped into my mind when I heard that. From time to time, I do face some contracts with suppliers that are unique, but not necessarily as big. We are way bigger than the supplier itself. But he does, oh wow, this is what I want to do. This is the clauses that I want to have in the contract. And then it turns out to be also something that you have to look into and see, well, is this a long-term contract? Or is he supplying a machine that will be delivered in 30 days and that's it, the contract is done? So these are things that I'll be taking into consideration. Okay, I'll do business with you on the basis that you are proposing, considering the risk of the contract itself. But it doesn't mean that necessarily because one company is bigger than the other that is necessarily going to prevail. Sorry about getting off topic here.
No problem. We're going to open for questions soon. Nilo, quickly, how much flexibility you have when deciding what to arbitrate and how to arbitrate?
So not much, because what to arbitrate, the Brazilian arbitration law says that the public sector can only be involved in matters of disposable property rights. I will give a prize to anybody who help us to define what this concept means. It's impossible. It's impossible. There are so many criteria and none of them looks good enough. And that's the bad part. And we have a mandatory legal requirement, which is ambiguous and hard to define. But the good part is that our interpretation of disposable property rights has grown more extensive in the last years. It's very evident, it's very clear, and not only in PE, but in the federal legal department as a whole, because we see the arbitration agreement as a means to attract investment. So we try to give it as much effect as possible. So that's the answer, a fast answer to what to arbitrate. And sorry, the second one was the flexibility. Okay, and the flexibility, our arbitration agreements are the same for each company that acquires the contract in the same bid round. So it's like non-negotiable at the moment of the signature of the contract, but we have 3 moments in which we can see the application of parties' autonomy. First, before issuing the documents of the bid, or the draft of the contract, and consequently the draft of the arbitration agreement, we submit it to public consultation, where the companies are free to make suggestions. Second, when the dispute arises, but before the initiation of the proceeding, we can sit with the concessionaire and do a submission agreement to update the original arbitration clause. And after that, the third moment would be in the offset of the proceedings. When discussing the terms of reference, we also negotiate the rules of the proceeding, the procedural rules to suit both parties' necessities, and that's it.
Thank you. We would like to hear your questions now.
Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, my question is for André. Hello, André. My name is André as well. So you probably saw, I think, 1 month ago, I think maybe 1.5 months ago, an interview published by, no, it's not an interview, it was an event cover published by Folha de São Paulo in Brazil, where Alex D'Ambrosio, the General Counsel, the VP Legal of Vale, said that he doesn't want to use domestic arbitration in Brazil anymore, in part because disclosure issues and the availability of arbitrators and all of these things. And he said he would prefer, even when the contract is with another Brazilian party, he would prefer to arbitrate the dispute abroad. So my question for you is, has CSN, have you thought about this before? Are you considering, depending on the size of the project, to maybe choose the seat of the arbitration outside and maybe keeping the Brazilian law as applicable? Have you thought about this before? Thank you.
Hi, André. Thank you for your thoughts on the question. I can't comment properly on that comment from D'Ambrosio, but I can tell you what is my view on using arbitration, domestic arbitration, and litigation itself in Brazil. As I said in a few moments earlier, international arbitration will be, or arbitration itself will be second best that you can achieve when you're, especially in international arbitration, because we always want to take our disputes home. It is comfortable, predictable. You'll be happy with the result, or at least you'll be comfortable with it. And this is, I guess this is common ground. About using arbitration, litigation, international arbitration, setting the site of the arbitration outside Brazil, having Brazilian parties, as I said, from my perspective and experience as more than 20 years practicing law, I rather be consistent and simple, because when I come to the dispute, I have a lot to think about in terms of strategy. What did happen on the execution of the contract? What were the terms? What was fought when the contract itself was born? Because in Brazil, what you have in mind about the contract does matter. It's not only what's written on the paper. What is your intention with this contract? So this is also something I take in consideration when choosing arbitration, litigation, or setting the site abroad. I wouldn't set the site abroad, despite from very particular situations. And I would be consistent. If I have a Brazilian party and I choose to arbitrate that contract, arbitrate not out, to put an arbitration clause in that contract, this is a tool that I choose from my box, from the lawyer's box or the law box, so to say. We'll be better off with an arbitration in this case because of what is being contracted on, because of the risk of the contract or how particular that matter is. Maybe our courts aren't familiar with that subject. Maybe any other circumstances can make you choose from arbitration, litigation, or setting site abroad. And I wouldn't set site abroad and use Brazilian law as material law in the contract because, again, it's inconsistent. Where I'm going to find the arbitrators, I'll end up with arbitrators in the site abroad having to be taught about Brazilian law during the arbitration. It doesn't make much sense. Yeah, as always. So, long story short, I'll stay consistent and choose wisely from the box when to use arbitration, when to use litigation, and when to go abroad. I guess it's every contract is a different situation.
Carlos, this is being recorded. You are conflicted forever.
Thank you, Felipe. Just we were quickly discussing with Felipe whether we, from the ICC perspective, had seen a case where we had two parties from Brazil, Brazilian applicable law, and then we had the seat in another country. And I haven't seen it myself, but in arbitration, probably in the world of law, I will never say that hasn't happened. It has probably happened, but I don't think it is common at all. And just to give you an insight on how the court works, if we're going to go and fix the place of the arbitration because the arbitration clause doesn't establish it, and we have two Brazilian parties, Brazilian applicable law, and another element, or maybe not even another element, but just those two together, I'm 99.9% sure that the court is going to fix the place of the arbitration in Brazil, unless there is some kind of element that would push you away from Brazil that has a lot of weight in the case. We're going to go and fix the place in Brazil because, as André was just saying, it's just the thing that makes the most sense. So that is what would happen inside the court.
Sorry, just to say to the students in the room that we have a lecture at the Center of Commercial Law Studies tomorrow with Nilo Santos, tomorrow at 11 a.m., room 3.1. And I'm going to ask a question to Maria, because basically she's my boss at Queen Mary, so... Yes, exactly. So, talking about investment arbitration, which is something that it's not something I have practiced in my life, but I've been following a lot of discussions on that. Freshfield's arbitration lecture the other day, you were there, you saw the end of the lecture, Christopher Greenwood saying that we should pay close attention to the criticisms of arbitration, of investment arbitration. He made a caveat in the end that I'm not going to go there. A few weeks before that, a short film was launched called El Tribunal, or The Tribunal, which tells the story of an exit arbitration from the perspective of a local community in Ecuador. And given how representative Latin American countries are in investment arbitrations, as you just pointed, you both said this today here. Is this bringing the communities, bringing the affected communities into the arbitration, into the investment arbitrations, finding a system, finding a procedural template under which this could happen? Should we be trying to do this to protect investment arbitration instead of focusing on ethical code of ethics, double hatting, and all of those things that might not be so important to the legitimacy crisis that we keep saying on GAR, always mentioning a Latin American case?
So I'll be very brief, I promise. The best way in which that we currently have, and I don't foresee that changing very much in the foreseeable future, by bringing in those kind of considerations and voices to the scheme, is what I also mentioned, the amicus curiae briefs. So this is exactly the vehicle that arbitral tribunals allowed for those considerations to be heard in the context of an investment case. A couple of additional points to that, because you tied that to, isn't it an alternative? Is it one way that we can fix the system so that we don't have to deal with other means? Indeed, there are different types of reforms that are being discussed, and very, very, very briefly, one idea is, well, let's get rid of the whole thing altogether and go back to courts. This is not a very successful one. This is not the one that pretty much any serious discussant on the game is actually putting forward, including the European Union. Second way is, okay, let's look at the system we have and focus on stuff that we can improve. And I think that's where your point comes in. I'm very open to hearing your ideas as to how technically we can have more injections of those kind of considerations, because from my perspective and looking at the scheme, it's amicus curiae briefs and then a wholly new set of points and discussion, which I'm not going to get there, would be allowing states to bring counterclaims on the basis of human rights or let's say environmental violations, etc. So these are the two legal vehicles that I see as potential ways in which this can come into play. And then, of course, just to finish the enlisting of options, we have the investment court system. So within this broad scheme of options, Carlos's point falls under the scope of let's keep the system we have, but let's kind of be let's be smart, more intelligent as to the kind of changes that we're putting forward. I put a lot in the plate, but the question.
Well, thank you very much to the panelists for bringing your experience. We invite you all for drinks. It's going to be in the restaurants, and you're going to be guided through that door. Thank you very much.